Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that is going to be reviewing the year that was. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty good. I think we discussed in our Patreon episode how we've been spending Christmas very much apart from people due to all the rules, which is how it has to be. But yeah, I mean, feeling pretty chipper given what this year has been so far. And I suppose that's maybe a point to kind of mention. I was listening back to last year's prediction episode, which we recorded in person at your house, like face to face, which is so weird to hear us hearing back, just being like, oh, here we are face to face, because obviously I normally see you at New Year. And so that's kind of interesting. That, you know, off the bat, we didn't predict a global pandemic. Surprise, surprise. But no, we're here to discuss our predictions from last year with regards to politics. So what I've done is I've gone and listened to our old episode, pulled out all the relevant predictions we made from that fairly long episode. And I think I've kind of scored them, but you may disagree with my colouring. I know I sent it to you earlier, so I've got things which are in green. We've done majority green for things where we were correct. And then there's some more interesting things to kind of talk about where I've put in yellow, where they're kind of a bit more nuanced. And then some things in red, but just there's a few things I've asterisked throughout this document because obviously they have been affected by COVID. So I suppose we should just bang on into this list. So first up, we had the Brexit process. And Rob, your first prediction was Boris will declare Brexit done and it won't be in the news, but he'll still need to negotiate the rest. He has given himself this weird ticking clock. Now, I think all of those parts are true. Except I think the reason I kind of put it in yellow is the reason it wasn't in the news might not have been just because he said Brexit was done. Might have been because we had a slightly bigger news story this year.
Yeah. I'm trying to work out what I meant by won't be in the news. Maybe it was...
I think your argument was, because I listened to it earlier today, I think your argument was he will say it's done on January, whatever that date was.
30,
it might have been the start of February.
31st, yeah.
Yeah. So he was like, oh, so Brexit is done, and then won't talk about, like, he'll just say, look, I did my promise from the election, it's done. And then it would try not to get it mentioned at all, despite the fact in the background there was all this negotiating going on for the actual deal.
Yeah. I think that was pretty much the case. Obviously, the news was dominated by COVID a lot more. But just looking at the arguments that I posited in our last podcast and the ones where we thought no deal was a possibility, even if we thought it was a lot of grandstanding, one of the Conservatives' main arguments was that, oh no, we did the oven-ready deal, we voted on and we got through Parliament, and that's what happened on January 31st. That's done. Don't worry about this other thing. So, yeah, no, I see what you mean, and definitely it was...
Yeah, I chose to kind of separate out your second argument here, which you'll see I highlighted in green. You were like, there'll be more of a blame game, pinning it on the EU. You did ask whether Boris would be brave enough for no deal or whether he would extend it again. And I suppose I didn't really highlight that because we haven't got a no deal, so he has got a deal. And in that deal, there are certain things that have been extended. So I suppose he hasn't pushed it off into the distance, but it is kind of... those were questions you raised as opposed to an actual prediction. So that's fine. And the other thing you said was he would be on a high until around December. This specifically for Brexit, I feel he still did hold this most of the way up until December. You basically said it'll be on a high until suddenly we have to rush everything through, which is very much what happened if you take out all of the coronavirus stuff going on that made things a bit more muddier for the government this year, and definitely meant they didn't do as well from public opinion, as far as public opinion is concerned, as they should have done.
Yeah, definitely. Looking back, it's mad that they actually waited until December, because you think when we got the first deadline from the EU, it was about mid-October. That's when we got our first kind of like, oh no, we can do it at a later date. And even, we postponed the last podcast because no deal was definitely had to be done before the 15th or whatever, if it had any chance of going through the European Parliament. And we only just got a deal literally on Christmas Eve. So they left it a little bit later than I thought they would. I'm pretty glad I said December rather than, early December, or it'll be done on the eve of everything.
I think you actually said this time next year. And bearing in mind, we're recording on New Year's Eve. They were a week earlier than you predicted.
Nice. Lovely.
But I don't think we actually thought it would be so close. my prediction, which I've put "be careful what you wish for" in brackets, was that it would be nice to see government discussing other things again, outside of Brexit. And boy, did we! But that was because of coronavirus, which obviously I didn't see coming. Yep. So sorry, everyone. 2020 is my fault for wishing for that. So yeah, I don't think I have much else to say there, other than I think maybe tying in the one thing we kind of talking about it not being in the news. There was that bit in kind of, was it October time when we had the internal market bill came through, and then it kind of bubbled up, and like coronavirus was kind of dying down at that point, because we're like, oh, we're out of lockdown, and we're out of, we kind of going back to work in this weird world, which is the new normal, before everything went back to lockdown too. So that was, I think it's kind of, it is that government has been doing these things in the background. It was very much when coronavirus has subsided as a story briefly, then Brexit has once again taken the fore. And as far as our UK coverage has been, I think that's fairly true to how we've covered things. We've covered what seemed important at the time.
Yeah, definitely. That internal markets bill felt like a Brexit throwback. That felt like, oh, we've got Wilko back and the House of Commons at its throats again. Like that was real. That was interesting political discourse. It was the only one where I was like, oh, I actually want to watch BBC Parliament live again, because there are real arguments happening, and it appears that politicians, regardless of party alignment, could go on either side for this. That's why it was so interesting. But yes, as you say, other things have dominated the news cycle, which I'm sure we'll get on. I'm sure we'll mention it a couple of times when we do our predictions for 2021. But it's weird how we thought last year that we'd move on from Brexit and we'd be back to normal government, inverted commas, so they can focus on things that traditional governments had before 2016. Brexit is a conversation that's dominated our lives for the last 4 or 5 years. I think we'll probably see Corona dominating our lives for maybe the next year or so, see how we go there. But we're certainly not short of big issues to talk about on this podcast.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely plenty to talk about. Just rounding out that Brexit section, the one other thing I said I don't think we're going to have a no deal, which I appreciate as a double negative. But yeah, I thought we would get a deal. I thought it was foolish for Boris to try anything else. I think that's played out over the last few weeks. I think the actual aim of no deal, I always said that I didn't think Boris truly wanted no deal, but he definitely wanted to threaten it in order to get a better deal as he saw it. And we discussed that in our last episode. So yeah, I think that was fair point to make. And then the other thing was, I said he has a majority, so he can ignore the DUP, etc. Or I think we may have both said that. And that has largely held, but I suppose the thing that's been interesting this year is a lot more backbench rebellion and U-turns and stuff, which someone with a majority you think could get away with not having to do. But as we discussed earlier in the year in our various U-turn discussions, he didn't quite use the majority as we expected.
Yeah, Theresa May sort of needed the DUP on side to get Brexit issues through. With his majority, it was a Brexit-proof majority, but as you just mentioned, it wasn't a majority on lots of other issues that weren't about Brexit this year, and that was a shock. But I do think that him being able to ignore the DUP has been seen as a boon for his deal. Like, essentially, they removed the backstop that Theresa May had in, and now we have an effective border down the Irish Sea, which is something the DUP would have never agreed to in the first place. They probably, I know, looking at the tweets going through, that the DUP have already said that they'll be voting against the deal that Boris Johnson organised in the House of Commons. But now he can simply shrug it off. Now he doesn't need to worry about it. So, yeah, that's why it just simply didn't even factor into the conversation in 2020.
So moving on, still kind of sticking with Boris, though, the Conservatives had just won a general election when we did our last year predictions. So one thing we made predictions based on was manifesto promises. One of your predictions there, Rob, was they will need to turn on the taps for money, which I think is true, but I'm not sure if that happened in the way we were expecting, with Rishi doling out money here and there as COVID relief. Yeah,
that was obviously COVID has increased the amount the Conservatives have needed to spend to proportions I think they never really envisage. If you compare their manifesto in 2019, they would have said, we're going to spend more money, but we're not going to spend as much money as Corbyn's promising. That would be madness. And now they've probably spent far more money than Corbyn ever would to try and keep the economy going. So make of that what you will. But yes, they certainly have turned on the money taps, but not in the way that I expected. Certainly not in the way they expected. And I think the big challenge for them moving forward is how they fund what's happened. And how they deal with the long-term economic fallout.
Because one thing you said last time was that this is the end of austerity. Everyone has decided we can't have austerity anymore, because even the Conservative manifesto was talking about spending more money.
But now they've got to pay for it, and that likely means some sort of tax rise. And I think that's what to look out for if Conservative voters will go for that. It does, you need to fund these things somehow, and tax rises are usually the most effective solution. However, they've also put forward other ideas like, Sunak is saying that they will freeze public sector pay, which again is moving back to a more austerity type vibe. I think I wouldn't have predicted that he would have frozen public sector pay. I think he would have aimed to edge it up ever so slightly, so at least they have the good headlines. But the fact that they are now going back on those sort of promises suggests to me that I declared austerity over in 2019, but with a global economic crisis, it'll be really interesting to see how they focus on things in 2021.
Yeah. The other thing you said was to look for issues outside of Brexit, kind of as we discussed already, with it kind of falling out of the news. But another one which I took and quoted verbatim because I thought, again, coronavirus has undone your prediction here. You said, not as much state interference.
Whoops.
And we've had a year of state interference, but I don't think that was their original plan.
No. If I'd stopped the podcast back at the end of 2019 and said, look, the government's going to tell you when you can and can't go outside, I think he would have stopped the podcast and given me a talking to. So, yeah, I'm glad I didn't predict that one. Let's just say that.
I said that Conservatives will basically ignore the environment. I think this is because I was a bit annoyed, I think, with the kind of jockeying in the manifestos where the Conservatives very much offered the minimum viable kind of environmental stuff. It's not the right word, but that's what I've got in my head right now. But yeah, I think I was annoyed a bit that, like, where Labour were promising things like we will cut emissions by 2025, then the Conservatives would say something like 2030 or 2035. And it was like, I'm glad that green issues have been pulled into the focus such that they're in everyone's manifesto, but I very much felt like it was a ploy by the Conservatives to kind of be like, we've ticked that box, and I didn't necessarily trust that they would follow through on all of it. The only reason I've put that in yellow is that actually they have made some changes this year. Like, they did bring up the date for getting rid of new petrol car sales in the UK and stuff like that. So they have done a bit of stuff. I do kind of think it hasn't been their focus, but admittedly in a year with coronavirus, fair enough. So I think that remains to be seen how they go with that. I also noted more protests, but obviously with a lack of people being outside, that kind of got removed. I was imagining there'd be more Extinction Rebellion stuff this year, and I don't think I remember any particular headlines around Extinction Rebellion after 2020 started. So I was wrong on that. Anything you want to add on that?
No, I think you've summed it up perfectly there. Like you say, that commitment to the environment, we might get onto it when we're talking about our point about Cummings and what we thought about him. But certainly that may have shifted. They may have ignored the environment until Cummings went, because I think you'll note that statement about getting rid of petrol cars was pretty much done a couple of days after they got rid of Dominic Cummings, and seems to be kind of like a carry influence. So it suggests that there is some environmental policy going on within government. It just may not have been at the centre of government for the majority of 2020. And
then my other point I raised was, would there be a focus on HS2? Because this is a thing that a lot of conservative voters in the countryside, at least in the southeast, the home counties at least, there's a lot of anger there against the Conservatives, but it's anger from a group of people who still always vote a Conservative in. I think I mentioned that John Bercow's constituency has obviously not been able to vote in an MP for so long because they had John Bercow, the Speaker, there. And with him gone, they had the chance to vote someone who was not a Conservative in. But despite all the anger there about HS2, they still voted a Conservative in at the last general election. So I was kind of wondering if there'd be more focus on that, the government trying to spin it positively, and talking about the Northern Powerhouse, all those kind of things we've talked about in the past. And And yeah, no, I mean, coronavirus came along and no one has mentioned HS2. I'm sure it's still mentioned locally in those places where it will be affected, but on the national stage, I very much think everyone's forgotten it's happening. So yeah, wrong on that one. And then I suppose we'll move on to your other point about the Conservatives. You said, will they continue with the Cummingsification? And your quote again was, they will stick with Cummings until he is not needed and drop him. I marked this in yellow because I feel like if they'd gone with what I thought was the spirit of what you were saying, they would have dropped him after the Barnard Castle incident, as opposed to waiting another 6 months. But they have got rid of him. So I suppose it's kind of not as soon as you thought, but they did get rid of him. And as you say, things have started to move on from Cummings already.
Yeah, he was more needed than I thought he was. We've mentioned it lots in this podcast this year, but the amount of political capital they lost over that Barnard Castle incident was surprising to me. But the fact that he did go in the end, and the fact that he kind of went when a deal with the EU was very much on the horizon, although they ramped up the no-deal rhetoric, and there is still, I think we'll see in the coming days and weeks after we've had this deal go through Parliament and passed, there'll still be a bit of like a Cummings culture war thing where basically it's like, aren't we great? We can kind of ignore the facts if we want to. Aren't the EU rubbish? Blah, blah, blah. And to make you feel better, we'll put a flag on a vaccine and make you think it's British in some way. All that kind of weird like stuff I associate with Cummings, which is more about culture war type stuff rather than policy. They certainly wanted to stick with that for a while. Obviously now he's out, but I think that style of doing things will take a little while for the Conservative Party as a whole to move on from. We've got to see. We said that things will be different when Brexit is done, and we can talk about other things. That's kind of my opinion on Cummings as well. That once Cummings has gone and once Brexit is really, really done, maybe then they can start to be the nicer Conservative government that cares about stopping the sale of petrol cars after a certain age. That type of Conservative Party, rather than the Cummings one that seemed just to be a bit more fighty and confrontational.
So moving on from the Conservatives, Labour. This is a section where I think we have all green, because the only thing on our lips at this time last year was what was going to happen with Corbyn gone after the loss at the general election. Who would replace him? And we even had a specific prediction episode on that itself, I believe, in the run-up to the Labour election. So you said that Emily Thornberry or Rebecca Long-Bailey would be the Corbynite candidate, i.e. one of them would drop out during the race to allow the other the shot. Which I think did happen, though. If I recall, did both of them step down before the actual final vote?
I can't remember. I think Thornberry dropped out before Rebecca Long-Bailey. I thought Rebecca Long-Bailey was the final one to go head-to-head with Keir at the end.
And then you said Keir Starmer is the front runner. I agreed. And I think in that later prediction episode, we said Keir would win as well. So, not surprising. We talked a bit about how Labour hadn't had a female leader ever, the only major party not to do so, and how that would be good. We also talked about how they could have potentially the first BAME candidate and leader of the party, but they ended up going with the safe choice, as we suspected, which was Sir Keir Starmer. And then the other thing you said, which I just thought I'd highlight because it was interesting, was you said there'd be no candidate out of nowhere, like there'd be no Corbyn in that election. It would just be the candidates we were aware of at the time, which I think was pretty close to the actual list who made it to the actual vote. Various people dropped out in the run-up, but I think the list we went through in that prediction episode was very close to the list that we had when everything was about to kick off. So, yeah, I mean, there's not much to talk about.
No.
Labour, we were mostly correct.
Like you say, we focused a lot on that leadership election, and in the past, particularly when Corbyn first got elected and then the subsequent challenges, those leadership elections dominated a lot more of the front pages and political time, and were generally a bit feistier. This year, of course, it was all put on the back burner, and I remember the COVID crisis was really coming to a head as the Labour leadership election was getting into its final stages. And although a lot of those votes obviously happened by post, and it was a little bit weird having Keir in charge finally when he got in was kind of just a relief to the Labour Party that it was over, and then they could focus on dealing with the unfolding crisis as it happened. We've talked a lot about how PMQs has happened this year, but in those very early days, Keir's approach was certainly to be like, I am here as to form a national government with the Conservatives to help us get through this crisis together. That kind of 6 weeks of after that first lockdown, I like to think of it as that first 6 weeks where the nation really came together and everybody was on the same page. Everybody was clapping outside houses. That kind of 6 weeks before things got a bit more. I don't want to say political, but things got more like, Keir Starmer felt that he was able to start criticising the government's response to the coronavirus and seeing that approach in PMQs. We've talked about it, how it's very different to Corbyn. He adopts he's an ex-lawyer. He adopts a very kind of like factual, these are the points, let me drill down into the detail and pick you up on these elements of details. What do you have to say for this, Boris Johnson? And usually Boris's answer is to not answer the question at all and go off on some tangential waffle that might sound good in a soundbite, but actually doesn't do anything to address the issues. So, yes, looking forward to Labour, as we will in our prediction episode, I think will be really interesting. Labour, as we were looking back on them now, we're interested about who the new leader is. He's had a very odd year in 2020 to come to terms with it, but I feel that to give my summary of Labour in 2020, I feel that Labour clearly has a lot of issues within the party. None of us predicted that. I thought this would be the end of Jeremy Corbyn and we wouldn't hear much from him again, despite some people who were Corbyn fanatics who probably said they'd never vote Labour again, but that would probably be true of whoever won the candidacy. I would never have predicted Jeremy Corbyn being thrown out of the Labour Party. Again, that was a big surprise when it came to what they've dealt with, and I think shows a lot of the challenges going forward that Keir has about uniting that party. And that's probably something we will discuss in a later episode. But there were certainly some things that I would have never predicted that would happen to Labour in 2020.
Yeah, I think it's just, as you say, we were so focused on who would be the new leader, because without knowing who the new leader would be, we couldn't really predict anything, because I think we would have seen a very different party with Rebecca Long-Bailey in charge, for example. So, yeah, I think all we could do is say it would probably be Keir, but there's a reason we didn't make many predictions about Labour itself. And, I think we just didn't have enough information. So it's not surprising we didn't commit to more on that. So moving on from Labour to the third and final party who kind of tend to make the headlines, the Lib Dems. So I think I've put both of these down as Rob predictions, but I didn't disagree with them at the time. So I would also say I agreed with them. So Lib Dems also needed a leadership election because not because they got rid of their leader, but because their leader had been voted out as an MP. There was actually quite a lot of switchover. I believe did they gain or they lost one? They only changed by one seat, but where those seats were moved around quite a bit. So there's a fair amount of churn in who was actually there. But Ed Davey, who happens to be my MP, was still there. And you predicted, and I very much agreed with you, he would likely win any upcoming leadership election. He was already standing in as party leader at that time. So I don't think it was a big jump. And it's not surprising that he did win. He didn't have any major scandal or anything come out. So it's not surprising that he just walked into that one. I think he got something like 2/3 of the vote, if I recall, but I don't have numbers in front of me. And then the other thing you said was they would struggle to find a new unique selling point. And I would 100% agree here. I don't think I could really tell you anything the Lib Dems have done in the last year, pretty much. Like, all of their stuff was talking about being against Brexit and how we could still change our lot. And then with the general election going to such a heavy Conservative majority, there was really no way they could argue that point anymore. And I feel like because they're not in power in any way, we just haven't heard from them at all really this year. I'm sure they've said a few things about coronavirus, but I couldn't point you to a specific headline. Yeah,
exactly. They've struggled to be relevant this year. Whereas with Brexit before January 31st, you would at least have a Lib Dem on your panel of Newsnight to give their opinion on it because they were different from the other parties. But on COVID, I don't think they've got much different to say that, Keir Starmer isn't saying when it's criticising the government in a certain way. Maybe we'll talk about this in the predictions episode. This deal that's happened with the EU, they may start to get relevant again. But certainly with 2020, it was a quiet year for them. And maybe it just sums up that I can't find anything else to say about them for 2020, but I'm really racking my brains to find anything interesting to say about them, which is unfortunate, considering how big a deal they were when they were part of a coalition government. They would have dominated a lot of the political landscape, but this year, unfortunately, we've heard very little from them.
Yeah. I don't think I have anything to add on that. I think that is, yeah, they just fell from the headlines very much so. It's amazing that, 14 months ago, the Lib Dem leader was there saying, we have a real chance of getting into government, which I know people laughed at the time, but that was their kind of head into the general election.
There was about a month before the general election, or before they declared it, where the polls were suggesting, if Labour go down 5 more points and the Lib Dems gobble that up, then maybe the Lib Dems are the second biggest party, bizarrely. To turn that round to now is really, really weird.
Yeah. So we've left the big story till the end, because I think that was how this is all in the order we predicted it. So the big story of the year, I suppose, outside of coronavirus, which obviously we couldn't predict, was the US election. So first in, we were still discussing who the Democratic candidate would be at that time. So you said that Joe Biden would likely win, and I also said that Biden would win the candidacy. So we were correct there.
Yeah. I think there was a time, maybe very earlier in the primaries in 2019, where it looked like Biden was out of the race, but he certainly had started to come back by the start of 2020. And yeah, he won. As you said, I thought that he would go slightly more to the left to try and retain Bernie Sanders voters, because I felt that was where this new coalition was coming. But I think Joe Biden was remarkably centrist and middle of the road, and that was his entire campaign, was to be as non-threatening as possible, I think, if that's a kind way to put it. And as well,
it's kind of we've had Trump, and here's someone who has been in previous administrations as a safe pair of hands, all that kind of argument as the anti-Trump in many ways.
I didn't think that would be we'll talk about this later, but I wasn't sure that argument would be enough to try and beat Trump. And I thought the way the conversations were going within the main Democratic Party was that they were heading more to the left. And you can see some of the rising stars of the Democratic Party, like AOC, are clearly from the more left of the party than Joe Biden is. But that core campaign team was, ignored that plea essentially from their Democratic base and went, no, we're just going to go trying to get most of the general population on side. And as we'll see, that had quite the effect when it came to the eventual election in November.
And another thing that's happened, which obviously we weren't talking about back then because we didn't know who would win necessarily, but a lot of those primary candidates, except for Michael Bloomberg and the slightly more out there ones, have ended up with positions in Biden's cabinet, assuming they all go through Congress and get approved. But people like Pete Buttigieg being given, I think it's I can't remember the term for it, but it's essentially the one that's town planning and environment stuff, because he's been a mayor and done town planning stuff. He's increased the number of bicycle lanes in his home city and stuff. So makes sense, So there are people like that, names that were, as you say, kind of rising stars, didn't quite make it, but they've all been involved in this, nearly all been involved in this administration. So that's, I suppose, it's kind of they didn't go necessarily as left as we were expecting to retain those Bernie voters, but they have incorporated people who ran against him in ways that make sense. Again, me being wrong, which isn't surprising. I don't have my finger on the pulse quite so much, but I was like, it's going to be Biden v. Warren for the Democratic primary. I think Warren ended up with a third of the vote, the third place, not a third of the votes, but in third place. Biden obviously had over 50% of the votes, and I think it was then Bernie. So I wasn't too far off, but I think Warren seemed a lot stronger at the turn of the year than she did a month or two later. So it's, just a misstep. I kind of went with what seemed to be the thing that would happen in the moment, whereas I think other people may have had a longer view of it.
I think you weren't wrong there. I think also I would have assumed that Sanders may not have gone as far as he did. I don't think he's got another presidential run in him for 2024. I think his time is over, but I was surprised that that supporters would keep going with him a second time rather than trying somebody new who was quite left, but not quite as left as Bernie Sanders. But no, it did prove that his core is very strong. And I just want to say, like, a quick hats off to Bernie Sanders as a man who, on both occasions when he's lost the primary, has instantly got behind the person who won the Democratic Party ticket. Like, almost instantly, he's endorsed them. And I think that was key, maybe more this time round than it was last time, for getting people on side for the main candidate. I think there was, last time with Hillary Clinton, she was an unpopular candidate, and when Bernie Sanders didn't win, a lot of those Sanders supporters said, well, I don't want to play this game anymore, took their ball home, and decided not to vote for a Democratic Party candidate. I think in 2020 there was a lot less of that, knowing what they'd experienced in the previous 4 years of the Trump administration. So, yeah.
So then we move on to the election itself. So your first big prediction in that section was Trump will not win the popular vote, which was based on the fact he had won a previous election without the popular vote. So, it wasn't surprising. And, that turned out to be true because obviously he lost on both counts. But I think you were kind of making a point there about the Electoral College and how the kind of states that would be voting for him would essentially buoy him in the way they did before. So, yeah, again, pointing out how the Electoral College is not necessarily the best system in the world.
Yeah, and it seems mad that I felt so certain about that prediction a year ahead of time, being like, yeah, he's definitely going to lose the popular vote, but that's not what matters. I think even up to the night, that was very, very certain. Yeah, it's just a silly system. We'll talk about it more in the past. We'll talk about it more in the future. But I'm sure Americans are well aware of how that system works and the oddness of it, that I think means that it's only, what's the odd stat? The last time that it returned a Republican president that won a popular vote was George W. Bush in 2004. That's the last time a Republican candidate has actually won the majority of the popular vote, which seems bonkers when you put it like that.
The follow-on from that you had was that there would be allegations of vote rigging from Trump, because you noted that in 2016 he'd started those even when he'd won. So it's not surprising. I don't think you necessarily foresaw quite how far that would go when it came down to the wire. But yeah, again, on the button there that Trump would try something like that again. Yeah.
He'd certainly primed the soil for it, and he made it really clear that that's what he thought of the electoral system. As you mentioned last time, when he won, he was complaining about it, so it's no surprise that when he lost, he complained about it. But boy, did he. I was thinking it would be a gripe and then he'd leave it alone, and he might have had a bit more decency. I don't know if that's too strong a word, but it's kind of like respect for the institution that all other previous Republican Party candidates have had, when you can fight and you can go down to the wire, and if it's close like it was in 2000, like Al Gore and George W. Bush didn't back down until it was settled. But then when it was settled, they said, okay, we'll let democracy take its course and I'll respect the result after it has been decided in the courts. Trump is fighting in a way, even when the courts reject him, even when everything comes across, the fact that he still fights, that's more worrying and might have more long-term consequences for future elections. We'll see. We might get onto that on the predictions for 2021 episode. But yeah, I certainly didn't predict that he would do quite that level of allegations.
So our final joint prediction that was massively wrong was, you said you don't see a Democrat win at the moment. And admittedly, we didn't know who the candidate was at that point. And I said Trump will win again, though I did caveat that because that's how you get away with doing well at predictions, with unless something big happens, which I think it's pretty fair to say it did with coronavirus this year. It's amazing to think a year ago we were kind of like, I know we always had that little bit of hope that Trump would lose, but very much our feeling was we don't know who the Democratic candidate is. And also out of most of the Democratic candidates, we were like, they seem to appeal to certain areas of the electorate, but not enough, not broad enough appeal to beat someone with the incumbent effect. Because the incumbency in the White House is quite a strong effect in their elections.
Yeah, exactly. And there were a lot of things going for Trump. I've just dropped something in the chat there, and it's something worth looking at. There's a theory called the keys to the White House, and there are 13 keys. And if you as a president control the majority of these keys, then in all likelihood, you'll win the election. And I think it's fair to say that in January of 2020, Donald Trump was in control of the majority of those keys. most importantly, he had quite a strong short-term economy and a strong long-term economy. You could say whatever you wanted on his social policy and his foreign policy, but the economy was booming, the stock market was booming, and, the often used phrase by Bill Clinton is, it's the economy, stupid. That kind of stuff matters to a lot of Americans. And that might have been enough to see him through. Unfortunately, of course, COVID came up, which meant that both of those had a big long-term impact, and you started to see Americans relying on, government handouts. There being checks sent out to people to try and cover it, but it wasn't enough. And probably, I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has not been seen as great when you compare it to the rest of the world. His approval rating certainly has dipped, and when you compare how he dealt with it with other world leaders, that's a huge missed opportunity for Trump. I think when he looks back on if he could have won the 2020 election, sure he could have. There are politicians around the world, for example, the one that immediately springs to mind is the New Zealand Prime Minister, whose handling of the coronavirus pandemic increased her popularity by a massive amount and meant that she was able to win a landslide election in 2020 with COVID because she'd handled it so well. When you flip that with what Trump was doing, you can kind of pin a lot of stuff that was happening and the reason why he lost on the coronavirus aspect. Another major key that's part of this theory is no social unrest. We certainly didn't predict Black Lives Matter becoming a huge social movement in 2020. And although Trump had a reaction to that appealed to his base and was very law and order, it certainly lost him support in big cities that eventually would turn swing states for Trump. And that's where he's really had the most sort of complaints. Places like Philadelphia, where they have an overwhelmingly anti-Trump bias against them. His handling of the Black Lives Matter, all those bizarre photo shoots outside the church. He just did a really poor job of being a statesman. So I think maybe we were right in January to predict that Joe Biden couldn't win this election. But those short-term crises, like the social unrest that was a big crisis for Donald Trump, and then the long-term crisis of coronavirus that he really mishandled, certainly switched it in favor of Joe Biden. And as we know, in the end, Biden was able to win. The Electoral College says that he took it quite comfortably. The popular vote says that Joe Biden was able to win it quite comfortably. But that kind of brushes over the fact that Biden was very, very close in a lot of those swing states where it wouldn't have taken very much for it to go the other way to Donald Trump. And that, Donald Trump was able to increase his vote share from 2016. Joe Biden had to have a number of people voting for him that was over the amount Barack Obama got in 2012 in order to defeat Donald Trump, which kind of shows what a gargantuan effort and kind of what an unprecedented effort that was to remove Donald Trump from power this year.
I don't know if it was just the line, but it sounded like instead of saying unprecedented, you said unprecedented, and I think that's a new word we should coin.
Please do. I'm sure Donald Trump has typed unprecedented before in a tweet, so
I'm sure
I'm just learning from the master.
We'll beat him to it with a definition. So thank you, Rob, for joining me, as always, for being on the show, giving me your insights. Thank you for spending 2020 being one of my friends at the end of a Discord phone call where we record all of these shows. And yeah, I mean, I don't think we did terribly badly. And it's always interesting to look at what we did and didn't predict correctly. If you found this interesting, make sure to tune in, hopefully tomorrow, based on how I am planning to edit this, to hear our predictions for 2021. Which we will also be uploading on New Year's Day as the plan. You can hear what we think about the year to come. As always, I'll just say if you go to parliamentary.observer, you can find all the links you might need with relation to the podcast. If you go to patreon.com/TTSS, you can throw a few dollars our way to support the show. And obviously that helps with hosting, equipment, software licenses, all that kind of stuff. So that'd be great if you can help us. And the other thing you can do to help out the podcast, if you think this is interesting and continue wanting to hear our thoughts on everything to do with politics, is, of course, to send people our way, recommend it. Word of mouth is one of the best ways for podcasts to get into people's ears. You say, oh, listen to this, it's great. And so, yeah, show it to a friend, tell them why you like this podcast, and hopefully that will get us more listeners in 2021 as we continue to talk politics to you. I don't think there's anything left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 See you in 2021. Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.